It is a pleasure and honor to introduce President Dorval R. Carter Jr. as the 2021 Thomas B. Dean Distinguished Lecturer. President Carter is known for his passion on social justice and equity issues, which is why I'm very excited to hear his lecture titled Our Work is Never Done, Examining Equity Impacts in Public Transportation. President Carter, the floor is yours.
While it is late afternoon here, it may make sense to say good morning if you're viewing this from Sydney, Australia, or good evening if you are in London. Wherever you are, it is my great pleasure to greet you from my hometown, the great city of Chicago, Illinois. Before I begin, I would like to thank the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Transportation Research Board for selecting me as this year's recipient of the Thomas B. Dean Distinguished Lectureship. It is an unexpected, deeply appreciated honor, made even more special because it is also the organization's 100th annual and this time virtual meeting. I would also like to thank Russell Houston, TRB's Associate Executive Director, and his staff for working closely with me and my team to assist us with every detail of this presentation as we sought to create an informative, engaging lecture you would enjoy during these extraordinary times. I would also like to thank Bruce Smith, Fred Wagner, and Robert Shea of TRB's Legal Resources Council. The Legal Resources Council submitted my nomination for this award, so this great honor would not have been possible without them. As you are aware, my presentation is entitled Our Work is Never Done, Examining Equity Impacts in Public Transportation. When I was notified that I was awarded this lectureship, I was told that I could discuss any topic of my choosing. Truthfully, I knew almost immediately what I wanted to discuss. As I considered potential topics for my address, Black Lives Matter protests were happening in the streets, not only here in Chicago, but throughout American cities and across the globe. Throughout the summer and early fall, a social justice renaissance was happening around systemic racism and its global impact. And I felt strongly that I wanted to discuss a topic that is at the center of transit struggle for equity and justice, especially in typically disenfranchised communities. Also, while it is true that the R in the title of my lecture refers in part to my organization, the Chicago Transit Authority, it is meant to speak more broadly to all of us, from the public transit executives who are watching to glean useful information regarding equity issues that impact their systems directly, to those of you who are completely disconnected from any conversation about equity by virtue of your vocation, but who understand that equity issues affect us all here in the US and beyond our borders. The transit industry finds itself at a unique crossroads during an extraordinary period in our country's history. Throughout 2020, the challenges we faced, like ensuring that transit services run well and that capital improvements were made, have been combined with an unprecedented public health emergency in the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to affect the industry today. An extraordinary thing happened during this period in the dialogue about racial and social economic equity in America. People across the country demanded a safer and more equitable condition for African Americans. The COVID-19 epidemic is shining a light on how lack of access to quality health care in communities of color and low-income communities make them more vulnerable to the worst health outcomes for patients infected with the virus, also an equity issue. Transit leaders are tasked with confronting and seeking to resolve these issues daily, and these events have culminated in a unique and unprecedented opportunity to investigate the impacts that equity in transit bears upon our society. Today, I will share my thoughts with you regarding inequity in transit, providing a review of the impact that funding has had on transit equity, and discuss my thoughts on the issues upon which I believe we all must focus if our society is to achieve true equity and access to public transit. A noted transit expert has described equitable transit policies as those that, quote, reduce the burdens and mitigate the structural pains put on marginalized communities, and in particularly those that improve access for and reduce hardship to racial and ethnic minorities, non-English speakers, women, people with disabilities, and low-income people whose needs are not centered in public policy. This definition helps provide a useful context for understanding equity. Unfortunately, this is a dynamic that remains largely aspirational in nature and too infrequently practiced by numerous companies, agencies, and organizations across the country. Today, transit agency heads and thought leaders have an opportunity to create an optimal level of mobility that serves all communities. But meeting that mark will require a steadfast pursuit of and commitment to real equity. It should be front and center, not something transit professionals should consider along the periphery of larger mobility questions, but rather as something that is fundamental to our business. This process will not be easy, and it should not be. Any transit agency head should begin their inquiry into their transit organization's equity efforts through this lens. If it appears your agency's methods of dealing with equity are easy, the right questions are likely not being asked, which will lead to discussions that inevitably miss the mark. Our responsibility is to have uncomfortable conversations about our confronting necessary expenditures in the face of inadequate funding in a way that does not shortchange low-income and minority customers. The goal should be to resolve issues that seem to have limits that bar an equitable result. The ideas and resulting solutions from these honest discussions will yield a greater benefit for your transit constituency. Inequity in transit has a troublesome history in America, and in my experience, mobility is a significant part of the equity discussion. The term mobility has great significance in any discussion regarding equity in America, especially in communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. For African Americans who survived sharecropping and the racist loss of the American South, newfound mobility opportunities for cross-country travel meant that Black people could freely travel north and west during the Great Migration, which spanned from 1915 until 1970, whether by car, bus, or train, for cities like Chicago, Gary, Detroit, and New York, among many other locales. This created the potential for individuals and families to enjoy the socioeconomic mobility that physical mobility presented. Today, mobility considerations remain at the core of the equity discussions that American transit agencies are having regarding how best to serve those who truly need the low-priced and widely available services of large transit systems. Inherent in those discussions is a question about accommodating the needs of people from minority and low-income communities, people for whom a bus or train is not a choice, but a lifeline, a reliable and low-cost mode of travel they absolutely need to live their lives. But what happens when we fall short in our commitment to serve them? Sometimes the impact of inequitable policy is not only foreseeable, but the result of intentional, explicit, racist policy decisions. Other times, the needs of whole groups of communities are overlooked because no one at the policymaking level has considered their needs. And on other occasions, creators of good policy and legislation do not realize that there's a blind spot in an otherwise fair policy decision until it is too late, a perhaps inadvertent consequence of lawmakers and agency officials' best efforts that nonetheless impact the community or group as deeply as an explicitly discriminatory law from the American Deep South of the 1800s would have. Fortunately, no matter what the reason for the creation and implementation of inequitable policies by transit or government officials, these concerns can be, and frequently are, addressed in court actions. In fact, the courts have historically played a critical role in defining and addressing issues around social equity and mobility. Recent dynamics surrounding the Supreme Court highlights its incredible importance, tremendous influence, and far-reaching nature of its rulings. It is, however, by its very nature, a court of last resort. While some disputes that find themselves before the 9 presiding justices present questions that are so complex or novel as to justify reaching that level, too frequently, parties find themselves arguing their cases in that venue because the system failed to catch, address, and resolve issues of inequity, or worse, intentionally did not do its job. It is always best to resolve inequitable transit scenarios before they are embroiled in adversarial legal action. We have a responsibility to not only follow the Supreme Court decisions that have struck down the insidious inequitable policies of the 70s, 60s, and the years previous, but also to be vigilant in our day-to-day responsibilities at the vanguard against similarly detrimental policy and decision-making. We achieve this goal today in part through enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964's Title VI, that was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, joined here by Martin Luther King Jr., and which prohibits public transportation systems from engaging in discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs or activities which receive federal financial assistance. While the goals of Title VI process are laudable, it is not perfect. For instance, under Title VI requirements, each transit system writes its own rules and evaluative criteria, including creating their own definition of major route changes and the parameters of what will constitute discrimination. As has been noted by transit advocates, Title VI creates an opportunity for transit agencies to too easily conduct an unnuanced analysis and feel absolved from doing additional work that's necessary to achieve actual equity in their systems at the expense of their riders. Still, Title VI remains our most effective legislative guard against inequity. Its ability to help create better equity outcomes lies in utilizing it as a ground floor, a bare minimum. Transit professionals must couple Title VI with proactive steps that will help improve access to transit and transit opportunities for minorities and low-income populations through policies, programs, and outreach. Past rulings against discriminatory and racist transportation policies have been shown to be about a great deal more than access to particular areas of buses and trains. These cases, frequently rooted in explicit racial discrimination, have changed our nation in far more fundamental ways than just the manner in which our transportation systems operate. While many pivotal cases have gone before the Supreme Court to resolve issues related to equity in transportation, two watershed cases illustrate the need for these protections. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson was heard by the Supreme Court and became perhaps the most well-known federal cause of action related to transportation. In this case, Homer Plessy, a Black man, sat in a whites-only car of a Louisiana train and was arrested after he refused to leave the car. The court held that the state law was constitutional. This case legitimized the laws that would apply the doctrine of separate but equal. 50 years after Plessy, in 1946, the Supreme Court heard Morgan versus Virginia. In Morgan, an African-American woman was traveling on a bus between Virginia and Maryland. While in Virginia, the bus driver asked Morgan to move seats, and she refused. She was convicted under a Virginia statute that required all motor vehicle carriers to separate passengers on the basis of race. The Supreme Court found that the statute was unconstitutional. This landmark ruling represents an important victory for the civil rights movement and desegregation in transportation. Miss Morgan's actions foreshadowed Rosa Parks' more famous actions a decade later. Issues of inequity involve matters beyond race, such as socioeconomic status or physical limitations that are barriers to access. As such, the struggles for access for people with disabilities showcases another decades-long battle in our country's struggle to adequately address the issues of equity. One case that is particularly important to me is Kent Jones versus the Chicago Transit Authority, because I was directly involved in it. In fact, I was a young staff attorney representing the CTA, the same agency that I lead today. In Jones, the plaintiffs filed a discrimination complaint against CTA in 1988, demanding that CTA install wheelchair lifts onto our buses. The Illinois Human Rights Commission ultimately found for the plaintiffs, determining that CTA had violated the state's Human Rights Act and that our system must be made accessible to people with disabilities. The court directed CTA to include lifts on our buses. As a result of this case, CTA made key changes to benefit people with disabilities, recognizing that it was the right and equitable thing to do. Every time a CTA bus wheelchair ramp is deployed for someone who needs that accommodation, or the special areas for persons with disabilities aboard our buses and trains, its existence can be directly traced to that case and the subsequently implemented Americans with Disabilities Act. Today, every CTA bus and over 70% of CTA's 145 rail stations are accessible, and CTA has issued a plan to reach 100% accessibility in the near future. That experience, very early in my career, where I was asked to work against the proper equity outcome, had the unexpected but fortunate consequence of helping to prepare me to execute equitable policies and practices on the ground. Since that case, I've considered myself an advocate for people with disabilities and am firmly committed to working on issues related to transit equity. I learned up close the profound effects of inequity and am now better equipped to not accept the rationalizations that people make to avoid addressing issues of equity. Throughout my career as a transit professional, I have seen a spectrum of issues related to inequity, ranging from overtly racist policies to absolutely unintended consequences of otherwise good laws and regulations. Too often in American society, some people believe that because a particular racial issue has been corrected, such as striking down a bad law or policy that caused harm in communities of color, that the core issue has been resolved. Of course, this results in an inability or, in some cases, unwillingness to recognize the frequently long-term impact the deleterious law had on the communities it affected. Transit is not exempt from this dynamic. While the problems that have arisen from racist transit policies in the past decades revealed race as a primary factor in denying individuals transit services, the issues that are generating systemic racism and inequities today are much more embedded into other, more fundamental policies and procedures that impact decisions, sometimes indirectly, that result in the challenges that are being discussed across this country. Modern systemic racism can be more subtle and much harder to immediately identify. For that reason, transit agencies should review their policies and weed out problematic rules and policies. Any evidence of systemic issues that still exist today that may couch themselves in acceptable, everyday practices that are having the same impact. It is the responsibility of those in leadership positions to identify and fix these issues. I have come across many instances of these types of discriminatory practices in my own career. While working at the Department of Transportation in 2010, the City Council of Beaver Creek, Ohio, a small suburban town, worked to ensure that bus service provided by the Greater Dayton Regional Transit Authority would not stop in their community. The closest bus stop was a mile away along a busy road. The City Council had decided that they did not want the service because they did not want others from more diverse areas who access the town's major mall and businesses, which also separated these individuals from available healthcare, education, and jobs. As a result of complaints from the community, we pursued enforcement against the city and were prepared to deny Beaver Creek millions of dollars in federal highway administration funding if they did not allow the buses to stop there. They relented. We were committed to seeing the decision reversed because the denial of this transportation option had a major impact on people's lives.
It's a great day for citizens in Dayton, Fairborn, Beaver Creek, and the surrounding areas because no longer do people have to walk across an unsafe overpass unprotected. No longer do Wright State students have to worry about how they get across, whether they own a car or not. It is just a win-win for the entire region.
Well, I couldn't think of how hard it must be to maintain your family and to feed your household and struggling to get to work like that. It is incredible. And what's incredible about it, how dangerous it was. So it's pretty emotional. We're glad to see that this has been accomplished.
Well, I think that it's relief, it's joy, certainly joy, and it brings hope because it brings hope that other things, if people coalesce, work together, other things can change as well.
Conversely, an example of an unintended but thoroughly inequitable consequence of an otherwise well-intentioned policy occurred on a project I worked on at the Department of Transportation's Federal Transit Administration in 2009. The city of Minneapolis sought to build a new light rail line with funding from the federal New Starts Capital Investment Program, a competitive federal grant program supporting major investments in rail and other fixed skyway systems. The city had identified the stops the train would make, and their proposed stops complied with FTA cost guidelines, which was necessary to justify funding for the project. While the city promptly satisfied the requirements of the application to receive a federal grant, FTA leadership was not aware that the city's significant Southeast Asian community had been denied a stop near their large population because it would have been too close to another station that the city wanted. Community leaders reached out to FTA leadership and we launched an investigation. After discussions with city officials, it became apparent that one of the FTA's long-standing policies seemed to bar the station from being built. Large-scale rail projects like this one, with costs in the multiple billions of dollars, require a cost justification with parameters and cost-benefit analysis around what is being built, particularly if the federal government is asked to contribute 50% or more of the total cost. If a project did not meet the cost-benefit requirements, it would not receive FTA approval for a grant, which would effectively make the project infeasible. While the policy was intended to ensure that projects funded by the federal government were worth the cost of the federal investment, this policy simply had an unintended consequence. In January of 2010, following our investigation and subsequent discussions with the city, we changed the policy and the issue was rectified, allowing the station to be built. The station opened in June 14, 2014. Because we were advised of this issue, we were able to create a more equitable circumstance for a community that was at risk for being disenfranchised. Still, it is notable that the FTA failed to recognize that the potential inequitable impact of its own policy played a prominent role in the issue, and that the public officials involved knew there was an issue, but did not object or raise it as a concern to the FTA. The issue was brought to FTA's attention because the community felt passed over. A clear example of what can happen when officials do not aggressively and proactively identify policies that may have inequitable outcomes and seek remedies to those scenarios. Those cases represent instances in which a discriminatory action can be isolated and addressed. There are, of course, instances of pervasive racial animosity that become particularly evident in transit policy decisions. A great example is scholar Jason Henderson's examination of the egregious inequity and racial animus regarding transit in Atlanta, Georgia. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Atlanta was experiencing an ongoing and racially divisive debate about growing public transit. According to Henderson, there had been, quote, decades of vitriolic anti-transit rhetoric and debates about expanding transit in Atlanta and arguably in cities throughout the United States. He suggested that this racialized animosity towards transit effectively produced full automobile dependency for most Atlantans, and thus contribute to the universalization of automobility in everyday life, illustrating how few whites actually took transit as they avoided interaction with Black Atlantans. He noted that the transit system in Atlanta, known as Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, or MARTA, was offensively referred to as, quote, moving Africans rapidly through Atlanta. Henderson also cited statements from suburban elected officials discussing their aversion to MARTA bus expansion in their enclaves, who confided that while they were not personally racist, they understood that many of their constituents were. To remain in office, he noted that politicians represented their constituents by resisting transit expansion or higher density development proposed to explicitly reduce automobility. While there are obviously many public officials who believe in and support transit in Atlanta and other cities, There remain individuals in public office who bring to bear the racist and inequitable beliefs that they and their constituents hold about public transit in the larger public conversation. This includes the coded language and dog whistles they use to describe their so-called opposition to public transit, which is little more than their cowardly way of saying they don't want minorities in their communities. Henderson's findings illustrate what happens when, unlike the Beaver Creek of Minneapolis example, federal or local officials cannot, or worse, refuse to immediately affect change. In fact, the Atlanta study shows what happens when it is the overall culture and not a singular policy that contributes to transit inequity. This dynamic plays out in cities across the country. While the examples I just discussed include decisions that elected and appointed officials made about transit, the most compelling statement local government can make to signal its belief in equitable public transit is reflected in the decisions they make regarding transportation funding priorities. The breadth of considerations that lawmakers, especially at the federal level, are asked to make is vast. Considerations are constantly being made regarding which modes of transportation need more or less funding and how to best allocate those dollars across the country. The budgets passed by federal and state legislatures are, by their very nature, policy documents that reflect the priorities and values of those who create them. We see this most pervasively in debates regarding the federal funding provided for highway construction versus public transportation. Working with elected officials and transit advocacy groups has taught me one thing above all. Public transit funding decisions are a direct reflection of who we value in our society. The apportionment of public resources is a resounding statement regarding not only how we perceive our moral responsibilities to one another, but a test for who we believe it's worth investing in. Unfortunately, in many cases, the current state of transportation funding indicates a lack of value being placed on low-income and minority individuals. While many of the people who use transit are riders who have chosen public transportation over a car, many more of those customers do not have that choice. They are from communities primarily populated by people of color and low-income individuals, people for whom these buses and trains are their sole realistic option for transportation. That is an important distinction. I want to challenge the thinking that public transit is well funded across our country and that questions of equity are best grappled with at the agency level. That is just patently untrue. Older legacy transit systems are facing perhaps the most fundamental question possible. Where are funds best used when they are relatively scarce but direly needed? Consider that most basic thing any transit system does is maintain its operations at a level that allows it to effectively and safely move people from point A to point B. That is a universal truth. For large, older legacy systems, however, that is at a significant cost, frequently not covered at the fare box. But that is only part of the issue. Every minute the system is successfully operating its fleet across these large urban areas, the other set of expenditures, like maintenance costs not directly and immediately associated with the cost of operating the fleet, are growing. Like any business, any agency can borrow so much money for things like stated good repair costs and other incurred expenses. For that reason, too many agencies begin to incur backlogs of deferred maintenance. When the public is given the opportunity to express their opinions about their support for transit, they have shown that there is significant support for adequately funding transit and the mobility equity benefits that come with that funding. One strong recent example of what can happen when agencies are providing a substantial level of funding is the referendum known as Measure M, which was passed in Los Angeles, California, and benefits LA Metro. This sales tax measure is expected to generate $120 billion over 40 years to expand rail, rapid bus, and bike networks, and will contribute to everything from operations to street improvements to stated good repair needs. Also, Seattle, Washington's Sound Transit System recently proposed Sound Transit 3, a ballot measure for providing funding for an expansion of their regional transit system. Its successful passage provides resources for an expansion plan that includes 62 miles of new light rail and 37 new stations. is another example where a majority of the voters made their appreciation for transit known. The origins of an agency's creation informed the financial stability of their operations. LA Metro and Sound Transit, for example, are modern transit systems in comparison to legacy systems like CTA, which was built 125 years ago. CTA itself was created 70 years ago following the public purchase of several failed private transit companies. The funding structure put in place at the CTA at that time did not contemplate the realistic future funding needs of a transportation system the size of CTA. For the 7 decades that have followed, this inadequate funding apparatus has never reimagined in terms of how Chicago public transit could be funded at a level that allowed it to effectively address its day-to-day operations, its necessary infrastructure, and its rolling stock needs, and the inevitable state of good repair investments, which now total more than $13 billion. In that regard, CTA is not alone in its lack of appropriate funding. According to the American Public Transportation Association, the national state of good repair needs is in excess of $100 billion. It is telling that one rarely hears a legislature railing against funding for water, fire, or sewer services. Those things are historically seen as public goods, necessary and fundamental to our society and available to all. They are also universal. No matter where one lives, those are things that people need. Transit, too, is a public good, as evidenced by the millions of transit trips per day frequently provided in the country's largest cities and the quality of life they enable for everyone in those cities. Yet despite this obvious fact, the agencies providing these services are constantly made to show their worth through the level of ridership and adequate fare box revenues, forced to prove our value and worthiness for funding to survive. These benchmarks do not capture the complete impact that these services provide in the communities that public transit agencies serve, especially in America. It is a far more complicated conversation than that. Those metrics discount the broader community benefits like access to service, congestion reduction, and air quality benefits that we deem important but are rarely considered. This reluctance to fund transit in a way that provides quality, affordable, and equitable transit service in a universal and guaranteed way reminds us that we, all of us, have to continue to work to make that a reality. Since its inception, the United States of America has struggled with race, class, and how to respect the basic humanity of and rights afforded to all of its citizens. Perhaps the most significant part of the American democratic experiment has been resolving the ongoing quandary of how best to advance and develop a nation that has its roots and centuries-long legacy of slavery and Jim Crow laws, with the intended horrific inequalities that are born of that history. As CTA president, I have made it a priority to work on focusing our agency's collective vision regarding equity to ensure that it takes center stage. More than at any other time in our nation's history, we are engaged with the community to ensure decisions are made with a focus on the people we serve. We know that every dollar we spend, every investment we make, and every decision we execute impacts our riders and the communities that we serve. We are also concerned at all times that many of those same people are individuals that the system does not serve adequately. Additionally, thinking about equity is not solely for those in leadership roles. Everyone at your company or agency should be afforded the opportunity to weigh in on and consider how you are working to ensure that no customer, stakeholder, or other party dependent upon your services is poorly served or dismissed for reasons related to race, gender, disability, or any other factors. As we collectively seek answers to how our systems will recover from this global pandemic, I believe that this health emergency provides for us a unique opportunity to think critically about how transit agencies, stakeholders, and advocates can change some of the most vexing fundamental questions before us today. I am not referring to getting past the immediate and medium-term hardships of COVID-19 has created, but of altering structural, systemic issues that give rise to the inequities I have talked about here. There's a simple bottom line at the core of this discussion. As public transit is currently funded in the United States, the choice between providing basic service on one hand, but also effectively concerning ourselves with and successfully resolving the issues of inequity is incredibly difficult. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced our society to really focus upon what our society views as the core responsibilities of government during this crisis. Early on in the pandemic, at a historic time in our country, American cities and states had to reckon with transit's importance to their economic and healthcare engines. Like police, fire, and water services, public transit was now labeled by elected officials as an essential service, critical to the ongoing functioning of the city. In the same respect, public transit employees joined the ranks of heroes, working tirelessly to support their communities. We are experiencing a time when society has been completely disrupted. Before the pandemic began, many transit agencies were pursuing better equity outcomes for their customers and the communities that they serve. I believe even now that the transit industry can further build on those successes and seize this as a time when our country can use this disruption to make transit even better, and in doing so, have a greater and equitable impact upon the customers we serve. It is my great hope that we do not waste this opportunity to reimagine our approach to transit decision-making and how we can ensure equity for everyone that we serve, but rather work together to envision a new, stronger, more equitable future for transit. The public discourse around equity is starting to have an impact, and we are seeing examples of new policies being implemented that are intended to address the imbalance of transportation investments in cities across the country, like Chicago, Seattle, and LA. These are places where elected officials and the public are putting real resources behind correcting the inequities that have historically impacted citizens and communities of color. As transit professionals, we need to embrace these opportunities and help support and implement them as part of our responsibility to improve mobility and access for all the communities that we serve. Public transit has served as the stage for many of our nation's most notable achievements in racial equity. Let us once again be the backdrop for true equitable change. Thank you.
On behalf of all of the attendees at the Dean Distinguished Lecture, I would like to thank you, Dorval, for that insightful, thought-provoking, and inspiring lecture. Your background as an attorney, a federal policymaker, and the CEO of a large metropolitan transit agency has enabled you to give us a unique perspective and deep insights into the issues of addressing equity issues in public transportation. You have given us much to think about as we work together to meet your challenge to ensure a new, stronger, more equitable future for transit and as a result for society. We now have an opportunity to continue the discussion regarding equity issues with Mr. Carter and a special guest who is joining us, former Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation, Anthony Foxx. Mr. Foxx and Carter will further address equity issues in public transportation in a discussion session that will be moderated by Hyuna Park. I will now turn the program over to Hyuna.
Thank you, Neil. I would like to introduce Secretary Anthony Foxx, who served as U.S. Secretary of Transportation from 2013 to 2017 under President Barack Obama. During his leadership at USDOT, he implemented streamlining initiatives that brought greater efficiencies to the funding, financing, and permitting processes. Secretary Foxx was an innovative leader at USDOT who advanced autonomous vehicle and drone policies, to name a few, and launched the brilliant Smart Cities Challenge. He has also served as the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and is currently the Chief Policy Officer for Lyft. Secretary Foxx, please share with us your thoughts on what President Carter has presented in his lecture. We'd love to hear about your personal experiences and your observations as Mayor of Charlotte and as Secretary of Transportation.
Thank you very much to the TRB and all of you for joining. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to be part of a conversation with someone I know so well who has built an illustrious career in transportation and continues to do exceptional work as the head of the Chicago Transit Authority in Dorval Carter. Dorval and I served in the Obama administration, and he served admirably as the general counsel of the Federal Transit Administration, but then also served for a brief time as a chief of staff to me. And our relationship and our history has stood up over many years, and it's great to be with you, Dorval, and it's a pleasure to join you. The piece that Dorval has prepared, his lecture, I think speaks to a number of topics that hit very close to home for me. Because when we think about the fabric of our country, and frankly, some of the issues this year in 2020 that have really grabbed the consciousness of this country, either George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis, or Breonna Taylor, or Ahmaud Arbery, or any of these incidents that we've seen over the course of time, not just in 2020, but that have somehow gripped us in a different way this year. I think we have to peel the onion back and try to understand what is underneath our culture that makes those types of things occur, and not just those horrific incidents, but also incidents that end up entrapping communities in transit deserts, for example, in ways that prevent families at the margin from having the opportunities they should have in a country that has the kind of resources we do. So I think it's in that frame that Dorval has reminded us of several things, and also pushed us to think more holistically about the way in which public transportation and transportation in general can be part of the solution and not part of the problem when it comes to a society that really is one of equity and inclusion. So just to come back to a few points that he's raised in his lecture. First, he reminds us that in the early part of the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement, transportation was actually one of the flashpoints. He reminded us that Rosa Parks was on a public transit bus when she was asked to move to the back of the bus. And that moment crystallized for many people what the civil rights movement was really all about. There's actually a little more context there too, which is that the way in which communities in Montgomery, Alabama, were able to desegregate their bus system was by boycotting the bus system, effectively starving that bus system of resources and forcing the local community to recognize the power that these Black citizens had to make those changes. And as a result, the walls of segregation came down, but it took more than a year of people boycotting and finding other means to get places, in some cases walking long distances, to make that point. So that flashpoint is one that should not be lost on us. Several other points that I think are also worth noting. There are structural challenges regarding transportation that I think we all must acknowledge and understand. And I think the historical perspective is incredibly important. In fact, I'd forgotten about the Morgan case from Virginia, where someone was traveling from one state to another state. And when they got to Virginia, they were told to move to the back of the bus. And the Supreme Court actually said, despite the state's insistence that was accepted practice, overturned that practice in 1946. And so the role of the courts have played in helping us dismantle some of the divisions that local communities and states had sometimes enforced should not be forgotten. We're obviously in a different day and age, but it is a reminder of how powerful the words and the pen of the court can be in establishing some of the inclusion that we need. I would also point to the funding disparity between not only transit, but frankly, all surface transportation against the funding for highways. And this is really critical. As Transportation Secretary, one of the things that I really tried to take on was really trying to explain how the infrastructure that we had built in the 20th century and really before then, much of that infrastructure had been built without the entire American society at the decision-making table. And as a result, not only the actual projects that were let, but the split in terms of how we pay for projects was based on a precept of a society that was much more stratified than the one that we hope to become. And as a result, the fact that we spend out of every highway trust fund dollar 80 cents for highways versus 20 cents for transit, I think has put a severe limitation in our ability not only to address inclusion, but frankly to manage mobility at a time when there's so many more inputs from micromobility to transit to other things that could actually help us reduce the amount of time we're sitting in traffic and help us get places faster and more conveniently and frankly healthier. So I do think that split has had an impact on our ability to address transportation deserts in our country, and in some cases that money has been used to create transportation deserts, and we need to look at that as we move forward. You know, Dorval talked about Title VI and the important role that the executive branch's intervention can play, and he used several examples of where that occurred during the time he was in the administration. They were all extremely impactful, and there was one outlier case that I hope we spend a little time talking about today, because I always like to push towards those edge cases that aren't as clean in terms of answers. But if you look at the case that you talked about, Dorval, on Minneapolis, where there were stops that were going to be taken away from a project, and the agency was able to find the mechanisms to get those stops put back in. Those stops were largely in minority communities. The question arises for me, and I think it will be questions that future administrations will face, is where there are projects that could provide, you know, for lack of a better word, remedial or a reparative infrastructure, but those projects become early candidates for being cut off from actually ever happening. What power, in fact, does the federal government have, either through Title VI or through other means, to do what was done in the case of Minneapolis, to try to help those projects move forward, where we know for certain that the connections they provide will be clearly improvements and helpful to the overall community. Last point, we are seeing communities across the country, Los Angeles, you pointed out, with Measure M, Seattle with I think Sound 3. There are a lot of efforts that local communities are now undertaking. I think Austin just did a major package in Texas, where communities are starting to take more ownership of both the funding component of getting transit projects done, but also reimagining their communities and in a much more holistic and connected way. This is an incredibly important point, and I think it also bears mentioning that as we look at future surface transportation bills, as we look at how to improve mobility in our country over the next several years, it will be incredibly important for these types of initiatives to continue, but also for the federal government to find ever more ways to support local communities that are trying to figure out how to connect their people. Last point, when we talk about equity, I think the one point that I hope everybody takes away from Dorval's presentation is that this is a whole of government issue. If you're in a transit agency, whether you're leading the transit agency, whether you're on the line, whether you're a repair person or a bus driver, this is a responsibility and a task and a role that all of us have to play, because if this is not part of our mission as a transportation community to bind up this nation's wounds, to heal these fissures that have been exposed, to try to connect people in ways that they have historically not been connected. If that's not part of our mission, then our transportation system will do nothing short of failing our country. So I am pleased to be here. It's going to be great to spend some time talking with a good friend who has been so committed to these issues, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, Mr. Secretary, let me just say, wow, you really captured the spirit of what I was saying in my presentation, and not surprisingly, you distilled it down to, I think, its core of the message that I was trying to give. And you know, you were right to point out the opportunities that exist today, and I think that's certainly a big part of the message I was trying to give. You know this as well as I do, is that mobility is in a renaissance right now. The conversations we're having about mobility, the impact that technology is having on mobility, is creating opportunities that never existed for the last 2 or 3 decades. And the challenge that I think all of us have as people who work in this industry is to make sure, as we take advantage of this renaissance, that we are not doing it in a way that ends up being discriminatory or creating barriers for access, but are actually opening up opportunities for access for the people who rely on and need that access more than ever. And one of the points that I made, which you alluded to, but which I think has really brought this point home, has been this pandemic. As we have sat here and watched literally the country shut down, the one thing that became very apparent in that process was the role that transportation was going to play in ensuring that those individuals who had to get to essential jobs, those individuals who had to, had no other options in terms of how to live their lives and address their needs, that transportation was there to serve them. And my personal feeling is that it has created the avenue for the conversation around how we view transportation and how we can improve it going forward. I'm reminded when you first came to the department, you brought together the political team and you introduced yourself to us. And you didn't start off the conversation with sort of this, and Secretary, I'm going to, reimagine reauthorization or all the other things that we normally talk about in the transportation. You started off with a very personal story about yourself and about growing up in Charlotte and about the impact that you saw when transportation worked as a barrier to minorities and communities of color, and how, as Secretary, your vision and your focus was going to be ensuring that we do not allow what I'm now referring to as the structural impacts of transportation decision-making, allow those types of situations to occur. And I don't think in any small part that certainly fed into the way I felt about the opportunity I could pursue, both when I was in the department, working with you on issues like sound barriers along expressways, where low-income communities didn't have the sound barriers, but communities that were more influential and had the political clout did have the sound barriers, to the flight patterns of airplanes and what communities they were flying over. These were like, revolutionary conversations that were happening in the department. And you were forcing people to view their responsibilities from a broader prism, which is exactly what I'm suggesting we all in this industry need to do. It's great that we can, create a new GPS-based, air flight control system that will make, flying, more efficient and increase capacity in that system. But it really doesn't have the same impact if you aren't also addressing what that means to people who are basically being impacted by what you do. And throughout our history, as you know, there are numerous examples of exactly the type of thing that I'm talking about. And the Minneapolis situation was an example of that, but it was an example that had a happy ending in that we recognized, once it was brought to our attention that there was a problem here, and we were committed to fixing it, which is a big part of the discussion in terms of what the role we play as leaders in the industry to addressing these structural challenges that exist that create the type of inequities that ultimately lead to much stronger and unfortunate outcomes.
100% agree, Dorval, and you said it far better than I did. I mean, look, when we started those conversations at USDOT, I think there were a lot of people who didn't think about these issues as connected to their work, which is easy to do because there's not a lot of kudos or any kind of review or benefit that's embedded in the way that projects are developed, that would make someone think that it's their job to think about these things. But if you think about it, the infrastructure that we build and the transit systems we build and everything in transportation is about connecting. And the things that are connected or are supposed to be connected or intended to be connected are the things that we value as most important. And the things that have not historically, and the people who have not historically been connected, have historically been deemed less important. And in a country that has as much history and baggage, frankly, as we do, it's time for us to own that as a transportation community. And I'm pleased that you are making the call to the transportation community to think about this.